In 1823, the United States threatened war with every great power on earth: France, Russia, Austria, and Spain. Without an army, without a navy, and without the ability to win a single battle. The threat worked, not because America was strong, but because it was bluffing. The ballroom of the Schönbrunn Palace did not smell of war. It smelled of beeswax, lavender powder, and the heavy, cloying scent of roasted pheasant. The air was filled not with the roar of cannons, a sound that had deafened Europe for nearly 2 decades, but with the polite scrape of violins and the rustle of silk gowns. Napoleon Bonaparte was gone. The little corporal, the Corsican ogre, was rotting on a rock in the middle of the South Atlantic. The nightmare of the French Revolution, the guillotine, the mob, the overturning of altars and thrones had finally been arrested. But in a quiet, velvet-draped study far removed from the dances, Prince Clemens von Metternich, the foreign minister of the Austrian Empire, was not celebrating. He was calculating. Metternich was a man who possessed a face like a marble bust, handsome, frozen, and utterly unreadable. He stood by a tall window, watching the rain streak the glass, blurring the gaslights of Vienna. To the rest of the world, the Congress of Vienna was a party. To Metternich, it was a triage unit for a continent that had almost bled to death. He took a sip of wine, his eyes narrowing. He knew a secret that the drunken revelers outside did not. You cannot kill an idea with a cannonball. Napoleon was defeated, yes, but the virus he had carried in his saddlebags, the virus of liberty, equality, fraternity, had infected the blood of Europe. It was dormant now, suppressed by the return of the kings, but Metternich knew it was waiting. He saw it in the eyes of the students in German universities. He heard it in the whispers of the coffee houses in Paris. Democracy, republicanism, self-determination. To Metternich, these were not noble aspirations. They were gangrene. They were chaos. And his life's work, his obsession, was to turn Europe into a fortress of order, where such diseases could never take root again. But to build a fortress, he needed a mortar. He needed an alliance so terrifying, so absolute, that no liberal revolutionary would dare lift a musket. The door behind him clicked open. "He is here, Highness," a servant whispered. Metternich turned. "The Tsar?" "Yes. He is in a mood." Metternich sighed. Dealing with the Prussians was a matter of logistics. Dealing with the British was a matter of trade. But dealing with Tsar Alexander III of Russia was like trying to negotiate with a hurricane that believed it was Jesus Christ, the mystic on the throne. If Metternich was the brain of the counter-revolution, Tsar Alexander I was its volatile soul. When the tall, handsome emperor of all the Russias swept into the room, the temperature seemed to change. Alexander was the savior of Europe. It was his Cossacks who had ridden into Paris. It was his scorched earth retreat that had broken the Grande Armée. But the war had changed him. The dashing young autocrat had vanished, replaced by a man tormented by religious mysticism and a messiah complex. "Prince Clemens!" Alexander boomed, his voice echoing in the study. He was not wearing his military uniform, but a simple coat, unadorned. His eyes were wide, burning with a frightening intensity. "Your Imperial Majesty," Metternich bowed low. "Vienna is honored. Vienna is a den of vipers," Alexander said, waving a hand dismissively. "We spend our days drawing borders on maps. We trade souls like cattle. Saxony for Prussia, Poland for Russia. It is soulless." Alexander walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames. "God has spoken to me, Metternich. Do you hear him?" Metternich kept his face impassive. "I find the Almighty speaks most clearly through the stability of the state, sire." "No." Alexander turned, his face flushed. "He speaks of a new order, not a balance of power, a brotherhood." Europe has bled because we have abandoned the teachings of Christ. We must not be merely kings and emperors. We must be fathers to our people. We must bind ourselves together. Russia, Austria, Prussia, not by treaties of war, but by the holy precepts of justice, Christian charity, and peace. He pulled a parchment from his coat. It was covered in frantic, looping handwriting. "I have drafted a covenant," Alexander declared. "A holy alliance. We shall govern as delegates of providence. We shall crush the head of the serpent of revolution wherever it appears, not for territory, but for the salvation of Christian civilization." Metternich took the document. He read it quickly. It was vague, mystical, and legally meaningless. It pledged the monarchs to rule according to the sublime truths which the holy religion of our Savior teaches. To a pragmatist like Metternich, it was high-sounding nothing. It was a piece of religious theater. But as he looked at the Tsar, Metternich saw something useful. Alexander possessed the largest army in the world. If this mystic believed that crushing a democratic uprising in Spain or Italy was a Christian duty, then Metternich could use that religious fervor to police the continent. Metternich smiled, a thin, cold curving of the lips. "It is a masterpiece, Your Majesty. A document that will save the soul of Europe." He didn't believe a word of it, but he signed it. And in that moment, the Holy Alliance was born. A dark cloud that would soon cast a shadow all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. The Spider's Web, 1818 to 1820. For the next few years, the system worked. The Holy Alliance, joined by Prussia and loosely supported by a restored French monarchy, became the policeman of Europe. Metternich sat in the center of the web in Vienna, watching for the twitch of a thread. But the virus of democracy was resilient. In 1820, the peace shattered. In Spain, troops who were supposed to sail to the Americas to crush the independence movements of Simón Bolívar instead mutinied. They demanded the restoration of the liberal constitution of 1812. They took King Ferdinand VII prisoner in his own palace. Weeks later, the infection spread to Italy. Carbonari revolutionaries in Naples forced their king to sign a constitution. In Portugal, the same cry went up. From his chancellery in Vienna, Metternich watched the reports pile up on his desk. To him, this was not a series of isolated political events. It was a singular, hydra-headed conspiracy. "It is the gangrene," he wrote to Tsar Alexander, "and one must burn it out." Alexander, terrified that the revolution would spread to Poland and then Russia, was no longer talking of Christian charity. The mystic had become the inquisitor. He demanded a summit. They met at Troppau in late 1820, in the bitter cold of Silesia. It was a gathering of giants, the emperors of Russia and Austria, the king of Prussia and their ministers. The atmosphere was hysterical. The monarchs felt the ground trembling beneath their thrones. They established a new terrifying principle, the Protocol of Troppau. It stated simply that the European powers had the right to intervene, militarily, in any country that underwent a revolution. Sovereignty was a myth. Borders were suggestions. If a people tried to overthrow their king, the Holy Alliance would march in and kill them. It was a declaration of war against the very concept of democracy. The March of the White Coats, 1821. The test case was Naples. The Neapolitan liberals, drunk on the poetry of freedom, believed that England or France might save them. They believed that the moral weight of their cause would protect them. They were wrong. In 1821, following the orders of the Holy Alliance, an Austrian army of 50,000 men marched south. They were the white coats, disciplined machines of the old order. They smashed the Neapolitan ragtag army at the Battle of Rieti. They restored the absolute king, Ferdinand VII. The constitution was torn up. The revolutionaries were hunted down, imprisoned, or hanged, in the north in Piedmont, Another uprising was crushed just as brutally. Metternich wrote to his wife, "A new era of salvation is beginning." But to the liberals of the world and to the nervous observers in Washington, D.C., it looked like a new dark age. The Holy Alliance was not just a treaty, it was a roving death squad for liberty, and the Tsar was getting hungry for more. The shadow reaches the Pacific, 1821. While Metternich looked south to Italy, Tsar Alexander looked east. Russia was not just a European power, it was a Pacific one. Russian traders had colonized Alaska. They had forts in California. They considered the North Pacific their private lake. In September 1821, emboldened by the success of the Holy Alliance in crushing dissent in Europe, Tsar Alexander issued an imperial ukase, decree. It was a breathtaking act of arrogance. The decree unilaterally extended the boundary of Russian Alaska down to the 51st parallel, deep into the Oregon Territory, land claimed by both Great Britain and the United States. Furthermore, it forbade any non-Russian ship from coming within 100 miles of the coast. In St. Petersburg, the American minister, Henry Middleton, was stunned. He wrote back to Secretary of State John Quincy Adams in Washington. "The Emperor seems to believe he owns the ocean." It was a signal. The Holy Alliance did not respect the Atlantic Divide. They saw the world as a single dominion of kings, and the unruly republics of the Americas were merely wayward provinces waiting to be disciplined. The Congress of Verona, 1822. The climax of the conspiracy arrived in the autumn of 1822. The Holy Alliance gathered one last time in the ancient Italian city of Verona. The mood was grim, determined, and lethal. The subject was Spain. The Spanish king, Ferdinand VII, was still a captive of the constitutional government in Madrid. He had been sending secret letters to the Tsar and the French king, begging for an invasion to save him. "We cannot allow a Jacobin sores to fester in Madrid," the French representative, the ultra-royalist Montmorency, argued. "If the Pyrenees cannot stop the revolution, it will infect Paris." Tsar Alexander was eager. He offered to march 150,000 Russian troops all the way across Europe to smash the Spanish liberals. Metternich, ever the calculator, preferred not to have Russian troops marching through his backyard. He maneuvered the French into doing the dirty work. The Congress authorized France to invade Spain. But then, the conversation turned to the topic that made the American observers in the gallery hold their breath. Spanish America. The vast Spanish Empire in the Americas, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Peru, had largely declared independence. Led by men like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín, they had thrown off the royal yoke and established republics. To the Holy Alliance, this was intolerable. It was a continent-sized French Revolution. When the legitimate king is restored to the throne of Madrid, the Tsar's ministers argued, he will naturally require assistance to recover his stolen colonies. The plan was whispered in the corridors of Verona. Once the French army crushed the government in Madrid, the combined fleets of the Holy Alliance, French and perhaps Russian ships, could carry an expeditionary force across the Atlantic. They would bombard Cartagena, seize Veracruz, and march on Mexico City and Lima. They would hang the bandits like Bolívar and restore the absolute authority of the Spanish crown. And what of the United States? That upstart republic to the north? The diplomats at Verona sneered. The United States was a weak coastal nation with a microscopic navy and an army that barely existed. If the Holy Alliance decided to recolonize the Americas, what could Washington do? Write a stern letter? The sheer scale of the threat was existential. If France took Mexico, and Russia expanded from Alaska, and Britain, though drifting away from the alliance, decided to secure Cuba, the United States would be encircled. The experiment of 1776 would be suffocated by a ring of absolute monarchies. The French invasion, 1823. The plan went into motion. In April 1823, the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, a massive French army, crossed the Pyrenees into Spain. It was a cakewalk. The Spanish liberal government, divided and bankrupt, collapsed. By summer, the French had seized Madrid. They freed King Ferdinand VII, who immediately broke his oath to the Constitution and unleashed a white terror of execution and torture against the liberals. The news hit Washington, D.C. like a thunderclap. The Holy Alliance was not a paper tiger. It was a steamroller. It had crushed Naples. It had crushed Piedmont. It had crushed Spain. Now, the French fleet was gathering in Cadiz. Rumors swirled that a fleet was being prepared to sail for South America. There were whispers that in exchange for help, Spain would gift the island of Cuba to France. In the White House, President James Monroe was pacing. He was an old man, the last of the founding fathers. He had seen the fires of the Revolutionary War. Now, in his twilight years, he faced the terrifying prospect that the wars of Europe were coming to his doorstep. But in the Department of State, a short, balding, bull-headed man named John Quincy Adams was not pacing. He was reading the reports from Verona with a cold, steely eye. He saw the shadow of the Holy Alliance stretching across the water. He saw the arrogance of the Tsar and the cunning of Metternich. But Adams also saw something else. He saw that the Holy Alliance had a fatal flaw. They were land powers. The Tsar had Cossacks, and Metternich had white coats, and France had infantry. But to get to the Americas, they needed to swim. And the Atlantic Ocean was ruled by a different power, one that was growing suspicious of the Holy Alliance's ambitions. As 1823 drew to a close, the stage was set for the greatest geopolitical bluff in history. The United States, a nation with almost no gunpowder to spare, was about to stare down the combined might of the European emperors. The shadow of the Holy Alliance was long, but John Quincy Adams was about to light a very bright torch. The heat in the Orinoco Plains was not merely a temperature. It was a physical weight. It pressed down on the swampy grasslands, boiling the blood in the veins of men and horses alike. Here, the air smelled of cayman musk, rotting vegetation, and dried blood. This was the crucible of the guerra a muerte, the war to the death. In the northern United States, the memory of the Revolution was already settling into the golden haze of history. Washington was a marble bust. Jefferson was an elder statesman tending his garden. But in South America, the Revolution was a raw, open wound. It was a savage, racial, and total war where prisoners were rarely taken, and civilians were often put to the sword by whichever army held the town that week. In the center of this sweltering hell sat a man who looked less like a conqueror and more like a fever dream of one. Simón Bolívar was 35 years old, but his skin was leathery from the sun and his eyes burned with a manic, terrifying intensity. Born to immense wealth in Caracas, educated in the salons of Europe, he had once danced with queens. Now he sat on a log in a camp infested with mosquitoes, wearing a uniform that was more patch than cloth. He was the liberator, but so far, he had mostly liberated his country into chaos. He had been defeated, exiled, and humiliated half a dozen times. The Spanish Empire, rotting from the head down but still dangerous, held all the major cities. They held the ports, they held the mountains. Bolívar held the swamps. "General!" A voice interrupted his brooding. It was Francisco de Paula Santander, his ablest lieutenant. "The men are restless. The rains are beginning. If we stay in the llanos, the fever will kill more of us than the Spanish muskets." Bolívar looked up. He didn't look at Santander. He looked past him, toward the west, toward the wall. The Andes Mountains rose like the spine of the world, jagged peaks disappearing into the clouds. To the Spanish general sitting comfortably in Bogotá, those mountains were an impenetrable shield. No army could cross them. certainly not in the rainy season. "We do not stay," Bolivar whispered, his voice scratching like dry leaves. "We go up." Santander stared at him. "Up? Over the Andes? In winter? It is suicide, Simon. The Pisba Pass is 13,000 feet high. The men have no shoes. They are plainsmen. Llaneros. They will freeze." Bolivar stood. He was a small man, but in that moment he seemed to cast a shadow that stretched across the continent. "The Spanish expect us to die in the swamps," Bolivar said. "They expect us to wait for the dry season. That is why we will go where they believe no human can go. We will cross the Paramo. We will drop from the sky into New Granada, and we will break the spine of the empire." He smiled, a wolfish baring of teeth. "Let the Spanish keep the cities for now. I will take the impossible." The Hannibal of the tropics. The march that followed would become the stuff of legend. A story whispered in awe from the coffee houses of London to the cabinet room in Washington, D.C. Bolivar led an army of 2,500 men, a ragtag coalition of Venezuelan cowboys, indigenous guides, and a hardened battalion of British and Irish mercenaries who had come seeking glory after the Napoleonic Wars. They marched first through the flooded plains, wading waist-deep in water for 7 days. Their boots rotted off their feet. They slept in trees to avoid the caimans. Then, they began the ascent. The jungle gave way to cloud forest, and the cloud forest gave way to the desolate, rocky moonscape of the Paramo. The temperature plummeted from 90 degrees to below freezing in a matter of hours. For the Llaneros, men who had lived their entire lives in the tropical heat, the cold was a monster they did not understand. They had no winter coats, only thin ruanas, ponchos. "Keep moving!" Bolivar rode up and down the thinning line on a white horse that was shivering violently. "If you sleep, you die. Move!" The trail was a slick ribbon of mud and ice, barely wide enough for a single file. Horses slipped and tumbled silently into the abyss below, carrying crates of gunpowder with them. Men sat down to rest, gasping in the thin air, and never stood up again, their bodies freezing into statues by morning. The British Legion, veterans of Waterloo, claimed they had never seen suffering like it. At Waterloo, you died from a bullet. Here, the mountains simply consumed you. But Bolivar was relentless. He gave his own cloak to a dying soldier. He carried ammunition sacks. He seemed fueled by a demonic energy, a refusal to accept the reality of physics or biology. After 3 weeks of hell, the remnants of the army crested the Pisba Pass. They were gaunt, ragged, and half-starved. They had lost all their horses. They had lost nearly a third of their men. But as they looked down into the lush green valleys of New Granada, modern-day Colombia, they realized the gamble had paid off. There were no Spanish sentries. The royalist outposts were empty. The empire was asleep, convinced that the mountains protected them. Bolivar drew his sword. It looked heavy in his weakened hand, but he pointed it down toward the unsuspecting enemy. "There," he rasped. "There lies the birth of a nation." The collapse, the Battle of Boyacá, August 7th, 1819. The end of Spanish rule in New Granada did not come with a whimper. It came with a thunderclap at a small bridge over the Teatinos River. The Royalist army, commanded by Colonel José María Barrero, was marching casually toward Bogotá to secure the capital. They were well-fed, well-equipped, and utterly complacent. When they saw a dust cloud approaching from the mountains, they assumed it was a band of guerrillas. They did not realize it was the Liberator until the British Legion fixed bayonets and charged. The Battle of Boyacá was short, brutal, and decisive. Bolivar's troops, fueled by the desperation of their ordeal, fought like madmen. They swarmed the bridge. They flanked the Royalist artillery. In 2 hours, the Royal Army of New Granada ceased to exist. Barrero was captured. 1,600 Spanish soldiers surrendered. When the news reached Bogota, the Spanish viceroy, Juan de Samano, didn't even bother to pack his silver. He fled the capital so quickly, he left money on his card table. Bolívar entered Bogota not as a guerrilla, but as a conqueror. The church bells rang, flowers rained down from balconies. The Spanish Empire, which had ruled these lands for 300 years, had been shattered by a man who walked over the roof of the world. But as Bolívar sat in the viceroy's palace, staring at the maps left behind, he knew the truth that the cheering crowds did not. Winning the war was the easy part. The shattered glass. The victory at Boyacá was the first domino. Over the next 3 years, the fire spread with terrifying speed. In 1821, at the Battle of Carabobo, Bolívar broke the Spanish hold on Venezuela. To the south, the Argentine general José de San Martín, another military genius, had performed his own miracle crossing of the Andes to liberate Chile and was marching on Peru. In Mexico, the royalist general Agustín de Iturbide switched sides, declaring independence and crowning himself emperor. By 1822, the map of the Americas had been redrawn. The vast monolith of the Spanish Empire, a territory stretching from California to Tierra del Fuego, had disintegrated. In Madrid, King Ferdinand VII, freshly restored to his absolute throne by the French army, was furious. He refused to recognize any of the new republics. He drew up plans for massive reconquest fleets he couldn't afford. He appealed to the Holy Alliance, begging the Tsar and the French king to help him recover his stolen property. But in the Americas, the problem was no longer the Spanish presence. It was the Spanish absence. For 3 centuries, Madrid had been the sun around which colonial gravity revolved. The king was the law. The church was the order. The caste system defined society. Now the king was gone. The church was divided. And the caste system was being torn apart by armies composed of freed slaves, indigenous warriors, and mixed-race mestizos. The empire hadn't just faded, it had exploded. And what was left in the crater was a terrifying, swirling vacuum of power. The vacuum in Washington, D.C. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams studied the maps of South America with a furrowed brow. The American public was ecstatic. They saw Bolívar as a Latin George Washington. They named towns after him: Bolivar, Missouri; Bolivar, Tennessee. They celebrated the rise of sister republics. But Adams was a realist. He looked at the dispatches from American consuls in Lima, Bogota, and Buenos Aires, and he did not see sister republics. He saw chaos. The Spanish have left, Adams noted in his diary, but they have left behind no tradition of self-government. No town halls, no juries, only the sword and the altar. The vacuum of power in Latin America was profound and dangerous. Without the central authority of the king, the vast territories began to fracture. Bolívar dreamed of a Gran Colombia, a massive united republic covering Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador that could rival the United States. But the moment the common enemy, Spain, was defeated, the local warlords turned on each other. The caudillos rose. These were strong men, local chieftains who commanded private armies of fierce loyalty. In the Venezuelan plains, the cowboy José Antonio Páez ruled like a king, ignoring orders from Bogota. In Argentina, the provinces were at war with Buenos Aires. Civil society had collapsed. Trade was non-existent. The mines in Peru and Mexico, which had supplied the world with silver for centuries, were flooded and abandoned. The fire in the Andes had burned down the prison of colonialism, but it had also burned down the house. Bolívar's nightmare. By 1823, Simón Bolívar was the most powerful man in the hemisphere, perhaps more famous worldwide than the U.S. president. He was the president of Gran Colombia and the dictator of Peru. But he was a man watching his dream turn to ash. In a letter to a friend, written by candlelight in a tent while suppressing yet another rebellion among his own generals, Bolivar poured out his despair. "America is ungovernable," he wrote. "Those who serve the revolution plow the sea. The only thing to do in America is emigrate." He saw the tragedy unfolding. The new republics were weak, bankrupt, and divided. They had no navies to protect their long coastlines. They had no industry, and this weakness made them prey. Bolivar knew, just as Adams knew, that nature abhors a vacuum. If the new Latin American states could not govern themselves, someone else would step in to do it for them. The British were already circling. Their banks were lending millions of pounds to the new governments, locking them into debt. Their merchants were flooding the ports. Britain didn't want to conquer the land. They wanted to conquer the economy. But the Holy Alliance, France, Russia, Austria, and Spain, wanted the land. Bolivar received intelligence reports from Europe. He knew about the Congress of Verona. He knew the French had restored the king in Spain. He knew there were plans for a grand expedition to reconquer South America in the name of legitimacy and Catholicism. The liberator looked at his fractured, squabbling continent. His armies were tired. His treasury was empty. If a French fleet appeared off the coast of La Guaira tomorrow, backed by Russian money and Spanish vengeance, the fragile independence of Latin America might snap like a dry twig. Bolivar began to draft letters to the only powers that might help. He wrote to London. He wrote to Washington. He was asking for an alliance. He was asking for protection. But in Washington, John Quincy Adams wasn't interested in saving Bolivar. He was interested in saving the United States. Adams looked at the vacuum in Latin America and saw a trap. If the U.S. allied with these unstable, chaotic republics, it would be dragged into their civil wars. But if the U.S. did nothing, the European vultures would swoop in, re-establishing monarchies in Mexico and Peru, encircling the United States. The collapse of the Spanish Empire had created a geopolitical hurricane. The eye of the storm was over the Andes, but the winds were blowing straight toward the Potomac. The question for America was no longer just about sympathy for revolution. It was about survival. Who would fill the vacuum? The Republicans of the New World, or the emperors of the Old? As 1823 progressed, the fire in the Andes burned brighter, illuminating the terrifying reality. The Americas were wide open, and the predators were hungry. The fog in London did not drift. It loitered. It was a yellow, sulphurous soup, composed of coal smoke from a million chimneys and the damp breath of the Thames. It clung to the wool coats of the pedestrians on Whitehall and smeared the gaslights into hazy, indistinct halos. To Richard Rush, the American minister to the court of St. James's, the fog was a fitting metaphor for British diplomacy. Thick, impenetrable, and hiding dangerous objects. Rush was a Philadelphia lawyer, sharp, observant, and fiercely Republican. Representing the United States in London in 1823 was a lonely job. The British aristocracy still viewed Americans as rebellious children who had accidentally succeeded. They tolerated Rush at dinner parties, but they looked at his lack of a title and his simple dress with amused condescension. But on this particular afternoon, the condescension had vanished. Rush had been summoned to the Foreign Office. Not for a routine query about fishing rights or timber tariffs, but for a private audience with the most powerful man in the British Empire. George Canning, the malevolent meteor. If Metternich was the cold intellect of Europe, George Canning was its sharp tongue. The British foreign minister was a brilliant, arrogant, and witty man who was despised by the absolute monarchs of the continent. Prince Metternich called him a malevolent meteor, a dangerous liberal who flirted with revolution when it suited British interests. Canning didn't care about Metternich's opinion. He cared about trade. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, tapping a quill against a stack of intelligence reports. He knew the French army had crushed the liberals in Spain. He knew the Holy Alliance was plotting to send a fleet to South America to restore the Spanish colonies. And he knew that if France or Russia took control of Latin America, British merchants would be locked out. Since the collapse of Spanish authority, British trade with Latin America had exploded. The city of London was getting rich selling textiles to Buenos Aires and mining equipment to Mexico. Canning had no love for republics, but he loved the balance sheet. He could not allow the Holy Alliance to turn the Atlantic into a closed lake. But he had a problem. Britain could stop the French fleet. The Royal Navy was omnipotent. But fighting a war against all of Europe, France, Russia, Austria, Prussia, was a nightmare scenario. Britain needed a partner. It needed a moral shield to make its intervention look like a defense of liberty, not just a defense of profit. He looked at Richard Rush, who had just entered the office. "Mr. Rush," Canning said, his voice smooth and cultivated. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "Mr. Secretary," Rush bowed slightly. "I will be blunt," Canning said, dispensing with the usual diplomatic pleasantries. "The situation in Spain is resolved. The French are victorious. We must assume their eyes, and the eyes of the Holy Alliance, are now turning west. To the Americas," Rush said. "Precisely." Canning stood and walked to a globe. "If France, backed by the Tsar, attempts to reconquer the Spanish colonies, what is the position of the United States?" Rush treaded carefully. "We would view it with grave concern. We recognize the independence of those nations." "Concern is noble, Mr. Rush," Canning said dryly. "But battleships are better. Britain cannot allow France to seize Mexico or Colombia. It would upset the balance of power." He turned to face the American. "My question to you is this. Would the United States be willing to join Great Britain in a joint declaration?" Rush blinked. "A joint declaration?" "A unified warning," Canning clarified, "issued by London and Washington together, stating that while we have no intent to seize Spanish territory for ourselves, we will not permit any other European power to do so." Rush was stunned. This was unprecedented. For 50 years, Britain had been the enemy. They had burned Washington, D.C. less than a decade ago. Now, the lion was asking the eagle to hunt together. "It would be a powerful signal," Canning pressed. "The Royal Navy provides the muscle. The United States provides the moral legitimacy. Together we tell the Holy Alliance, hands off." The trap in the Honey Rush left the Foreign Office with his head spinning. He walked back to the American legation through the drizzle, his mind racing. It seemed like a dream offer. The United States, a second-rate power with a tiny navy, was being offered a partnership with the mistress of the seas. It would guarantee the safety of the Latin American republics. It would humiliate the French. It would validate the U.S. as a world player. But Richard Rush was a lawyer. He looked for the fine print. He sat at his desk that night, reviewing his notes of Canning's conversation. He focused on one specific phrase Canning had used. "We conceive the recovery of the colonies by Spain to be hopeless. We aim not at the possession of any portion of them ourselves." There was the trap, the self-denying ordinance. Canning wanted a pledge that neither Britain nor the United States would ever take Cuba, Texas, or California. Britain was satisfied with the status quo. They already had Canada and the Caribbean islands they wanted. They didn't want territory. They wanted trade. But the United States, the U.S. was growing. The frontier was pushing west. There were already Americans in Texas. There were eyes looking greedily at Cuba as a natural extension of Florida. If Rush signed this joint declaration, he would be pledging that the United States would never expand further south or west into former Spanish lands. He would be tying the hands of his own country, freezing the borders of 1823 forever. Canning wasn't just trying to stop France. He was trying to box in America. The cat and mouse. The next few weeks were a diplomatic dance of high tension. Canning was impatient. He sent urgent notes to Rush. "Why do you hesitate? The French fleet is gathering in Cadiz. We must act." Rush played for time. He had no authority to sign an alliance. A letter to President Monroe took 6 weeks to arrive. A reply took another 6. He was operating in a vacuum. "I am unauthorized," Rush told Canning in a tense meeting in late August. "But I might be willing to exceed my instructions on one condition." "Name it," Canning said. "Britain must recognize the independence of the Latin American republics immediately." It was a brilliant countermove. The US had already recognized them. If Britain did the same, the point was moot. Europe couldn't recover colonies that were legally sovereign nations. Canning balked. "That is impossible, my king. He is not ready to recognize a bunch of rebels." King George IV hated republics. He wouldn't swallow that pill. "Then I cannot sign," Rush said. "The Polignac Memorandum, the secret insurance." While Canning was courting Rush, he was playing a double game. In October, realizing that the Americans might not bite, or might take too long, Canning invited the French ambassador, the Prince de Polignac, to a meeting. It was not a polite meeting. Canning dropped the diplomatic mask. He told Polignac flatly that Britain possessed the naval power to cut off any French expedition to the Americas. He demanded a written promise that France would not invade. Polignac, realizing that the French Navy was no match for the British, folded. He signed the Polignac Memorandum. In it, France disclaimed any intention of invading Spanish America. The threat was over. Canning had won. He had checkmated France without firing a shot. But here is the crucial part. Canning didn't tell Rush. He knew the French weren't coming anymore. But he still wanted the joint declaration with the United States. Why? Because the self-denying clause was still valuable. He still wanted to trap the Americans into promising they wouldn't take Texas or Cuba. He continued to pressure Rush, warning of imminent French armadas that he knew were phantoms, the dispatch sails. Richard Rush didn't know about Polignac. He only knew that the pressure was immense. In October 1823, he sat down and wrote a massive dispatch to President Monroe and Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. He detailed the British offer. He outlined the dangers of the Holy Alliance. He explained the temptation of the Royal Navy's protection. And he highlighted his suspicion about the no expansion pledge. He sealed the packet with red wax. "This," he told his secretary as he handed over the heavy envelope, "is the most important letter I shall ever write." The dispatch was carried to the docks and loaded onto a fast packet ship, bound for the Chesapeake Bay. Rush stood at the window, watching the rain fall on the London cobbles. He had passed the buck. Now, it was up to the old men in Washington. They would have to decide whether to grab the British lifeline, or cut it and swim alone in shark-infested waters. The ship sailed into the Atlantic gales. The fate of the hemisphere was in the mail. Monticello, Virginia. October 24th, 1823. The Blue Ridge Mountains were ablaze with the dying colors of autumn. High on his little mountain, Thomas Jefferson, the 80-year-old sage of Monticello, sat on his east portico, wrapped in a heavy woolen shawl. His frame was frail, crippled by rheumatism, and his debts were mounting like a rising tide that threatened to swallow his estate. But his mind remained a razor, sharp, curious, and deeply concerned with the future of the republic he had helped birth. When the courier arrived, breathless and dusty from the ride from Washington, Jefferson's hands shook as he broke the wax seal of President Monroe's letter. He adjusted his spectacles and read slowly. "Canning, the Holy Alliance, the British offer." Jefferson set the paper down on his lap and looked out over the hazy valley. For 50 years, Thomas Jefferson had been the high priest of Anglophobia. He had penned the Declaration of Independence, cataloging the crimes of the British king. He had navigated the young country through the stormy years of trade embargoes and impressment. He distrusted British bankers, British aristocrats, and British intentions. He believed the British lion was a beast that ate republics for breakfast. But Jefferson was also a pragmatist. He saw the map clearly in his mind. The United States was a fragile sliver of liberty clinging to the edge of a continent dominated by kings. If France took Mexico, if Russia took California, the American experiment would be suffocated in its cradle. The Atlantic Ocean, once a vast moat, was shrinking under the keels of European warships. He picked up his quill. The response he drafted would shock everyone who claimed to know his politics. The question presented by the letters you have sent me is the most momentous which has ever been offered to my contemplation since that of independence, Jefferson wrote, his handwriting spidery but firm. That made us a nation. This sets our compass and points the course which we are to steer through the ocean of time opening on us. He dipped the pen again. Great Britain is the nation which can do us the most harm of anyone or all on earth, and with her on our side, we need not fear the whole world. It was a breathtaking reversal. The man who had spent a lifetime warning against entangling alliances was now advising the president to marry the American eagle to the British lion. With her, then, we should most sedulously cherish a cordial friendship, Jefferson urged. I am clearly of Mr. Canning's opinion. We should oppose, with all our means, the forcible interposition of any other power. To Jefferson, the geopolitical math was simple. The Holy Alliance was a wolf at the door. Britain was a tiger in the yard. Better to walk with the tiger than be eaten by the wolf. Montpelier, Virginia, October 30th, 1823. 30 miles away, at Montpelier, James Madison received a similar packet from the president. The former president was 72, small, wizened, and sharp as flint. He was the father of the Constitution and the man who had actually fought the War of 1812. He had fled the White House just hours before British troops burned it to the ground. If anyone had a reason to hate the British offer, it was James Madison. But Madison, like Jefferson, was terrified of the Holy Alliance. He read Monroe's panic-stricken questions. He read about the French armies crushing dissent in Spain. Madison went even further than Jefferson. In his reply, he suggested that the joint declaration shouldn't just protect South America. It should also protect the Greeks, who were currently fighting a savage war of independence against the Ottoman Empire. It is particularly fortunate that the policy of Great Britain has presented a cooperation for an object the same with ours, Madison wrote. He advised Monroe to accept the proposal. Take the deal. Hide behind the wooden walls of the Royal Navy. It was the only way to ensure the survival of republicanism in a hostile world. The consensus of fear. By early November, the letters from the sages arrived back in Washington. Monroe read them with immense relief. The two greatest living minds of the Republican Party, the two men who defined American foreign policy, agreed with him. The alignment was formidable. Monroe, the president, wanted to accept the British offer. Calhoun, Secretary of War, wanted to accept the British offer. Jefferson, the sage, advised accepting the British offer. Madison, the architect, advised accepting the British offer. The consensus was overwhelming. The United States would abandon its policy of isolationism. It would become a junior partner to the British Empire. It would sign the joint declaration, effectively pledging never to expand into Texas or Cuba in exchange for safety. It seemed like a done deal. The panic had produced a policy. The cocked hats were ready to surrender American ambition for American security. The return of the bull. But on November 11th, a carriage rattled into Washington City from the north. John Quincy Adams had returned from Massachusetts. The Secretary of State walked into the State Department, shaking the road dust from his coat. He was short, stout, and bald, with rheumy eyes that wept constantly due to a blocked tear duct. He was not charismatic. He was not beloved. He was a prickly, stubborn, intellectual brawler who kept a diary where he insulted almost everyone he met. He found his desk piled high with the dispatches from Rush, the letters from Jefferson and Madison, and the frantic notes from Monroe. Adams read them all. He read Canning's smooth offer. He read the terrified reactions of the cabinet. He read Jefferson's advice to cherish friendship with Britain. Adams scowled. He didn't see a lifeline. He saw a leash. He saw exactly what Canning was doing. He saw the trap hidden in the honey. He focused on the self-denying ordinance, the pledge not to take Texas or Cuba. Adams believed in manifest destiny before the term even existed. He believed it was the law of nature that the United States would one day span the continent. He believed Cuba was an apple that, once severed from the Spanish tree, must naturally fall into the American basket. If the U.S. signed Canning's paper, they were signing away their future. They would be agreeing to stay a small Atlantic nation forever, hemmed in by British protected territories. Moreover, Adams despised the idea of the United States appearing subservient. It would be more candid, Adams muttered to himself, rehearsing the line he would use to shatter the consensus, as well as more dignified, to avow our principles explicitly to Russia and France, than to come in as a cockboat in the wake of the British man-of-war. He gathered his papers. He put on his hat. He marched toward the White House. The cabinet was waiting. The sages had spoken. The president had decided. But John Quincy Adams was about to walk into that room, look the founding fathers in the eye, and tell them they were all wrong. The lion and the eagle might be ready to fly together, but the bull was about to tear the nest apart. The cabinet room, the White House, November 1823. The fireplace crackled, but it did little to warm the chill in the room. President Monroe sat at the head of the long mahogany table, looking every day of his 65 years. Around him sat the men who ran the government: William Wirt, the eloquent Attorney General; John C. Calhoun, the intense Secretary of War; and Southard, the Secretary of the Navy. They were tired. They were anxious. They had spent weeks staring into the abyss of a European invasion, and they had finally found a bridge to safety: the British alliance. Then the door opened and John Quincy Adams walked in. Adams was not a large man, but he carried himself with the density of a cannonball. He was arguably the most experienced diplomat in American history. He had been a minister to the Netherlands, Prussia, Russia, and Great Britain. He spoke French, Dutch, German, and Russian. He had negotiated the Treaty of Ghent to end the War of 1812. He had, almost single-handedly, wrestled Florida away from Spain just 4 years prior. He sat down, placing his portfolio on the table with a heavy thud. "Mr. President," Adams began, his voice rasping slightly, "I have reviewed the dispatches, and I must dissent." The argument. Calhoun was the first to react. "Dissent? Mr. Adams, we are facing the Holy Alliance. France has an army in Spain. Russia is claiming the Oregon coast. Britain offers us the protection of her navy. Jefferson and Madison agree we must accept. Are you suggesting we stand alone?" "I am suggesting," Adams shot back, his eyes watering but his gaze steady, "that we do not mistake a trap for a sanctuary." Adams stood up. He wasn't an orator like Patrick Henry. He was a prosecutor. He laid out his case with brutal logic. "Consider the British offer, gentlemen. Mr. Canning asks us to declare alongside him that we will never acquire any part of the Spanish colonies for ourselves. He asks for a self-denying pledge." Adams pointed a stubby finger at the map on the wall, a map of North America that was still largely blank in the West. "If we sign this, we pledge never to annex Texas. We pledge never to acquire Cuba. We pledge never to expand into California. We lock ourselves into our current borders forever, while Britain dominates the trade of the world. Better to be locked in," Calhoun argued, "than to be crushed by the French." "The French are not coming," Adams stated flatly. The room went silent. "What?" Monroe asked. "It is a bluff, Mr. President," Adams said. "Think on it. The French army is exhausted from the Spanish campaign. Their navy is a shadow of what it was under Napoleon. They cannot ferry an army across the Atlantic while the British fleet patrols the ocean. Canning knows this. He doesn't need us to stop the French. He can stop them himself." Adams began to pace, his voice rising. "Why, then, does he ask for our alliance? Not because he needs our navy. We have no navy to speak of. He needs our pledge. He wants to bind us. He wants to prevent us from becoming a rival power in the hemisphere." He stopped and looked at the president. "It would be more candid, as well as more dignified, to have our principles explicitly to Russia and France, than to come in as a cockboat in the wake of the British man of war." The cockboat. The phrase hung in the air. A cockboat in the wake of a man of war. It was a devastating image. A cockboat was a tiny, insignificant dinghy towed behind a massive warship. Adams was telling the cabinet that if they signed Canning's declaration, they were admitting that the United States was nothing more than a dinghy towed by the British Empire. They would be admitting they were not a real power. "We must act independently," Adams insisted. "We must make our own declaration. We must tell the world that the American continents are no longer subjects for any new European colonial establishments, not French, not Russian, and yes, not British. But we have no power to enforce it," Wirt objected. "It is a hollow threat. If we declare this and the Holy Alliance calls our bluff, we will be humiliated. It is a moral standard," Adams countered. "It is a statement of sovereignty. If we hide behind the British skirt now, we will never be respected as an equal nation. We must plant our flag. We must assert that the old world and the new world are distinct systems. They have their kings and their wars. We have our republics and our peace. Let them keep to their side, and we shall keep to ours." The turning of the tide. For 3 days the debate raged. Calhoun, terrified of a French invasion, fought hard. He painted vivid pictures of French bayonets in New Orleans. He argued that Adams was arrogant, that he was risking national suicide for the sake of pride. Monroe wavered. He respected Jefferson and Madison above all men, and they had said sign, but Adams was relentless. He hammered away at the Russian threat in the Pacific. He hammered away at the British commercial threat. He used his immense knowledge of European courts to convince Monroe that the Holy Alliance was too divided to actually mount an invasion. "The Tsar talks of Christian duty," Adams scoffed, "but he will not send Cossacks to die in the jungles of Colombia. And the French king is too afraid of his own people to risk a war with England." Slowly, the tide turned. Adams appealed to Monroe's legacy. Did the last founding father want to be remembered as the president who signed away America's future to the British? Or did he want to be the president who declared America's independence from Europe for the second time? Finally, on November 21st, Monroe looked up from the table. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. "Mr. Adams," Monroe said, "you may proceed. We shall act alone." The gamble. It was a breathtaking gamble. Adams had convinced the government to reject the protection of the world's greatest superpower, Britain, to stand alone against the world's greatest land powers, the Holy Alliance. He was betting everything on 2 assumptions: that the British Navy would protect the Atlantic anyway, simply to protect British trade; that Europe was too tired to fight another war. If he was wrong, the United States could be invaded, partitioned and destroyed. Adams went back to his office at the State Department. He didn't celebrate. He sat down at his desk, dipped his quill, and began to draft the paragraphs that would be inserted into the president's annual message to Congress. He was writing a "keep out" sign for an entire hemisphere. And he was posting it with an army that couldn't fill a stadium and a navy that couldn't block a harbor. It was the ultimate bluff, and John Quincy Adams, the lone wolf, was the only man in Washington with the nerve to call it. The State Department. Late November, 1823, the victory in the Cabinet Room was only the beginning. Now, John Quincy Adams had to turn a philosophical argument into a diplomatic weapon. He sat at his desk, surrounded by scraps of parchment. The air in the office was stale, thick with tobacco smoke and the dust of old treaties. Adams was a man who weaponized language. He knew that in diplomacy, a vague word could lead to a war, while a precise one could prevent it. He wasn't writing a treaty. He wasn't writing a law. He was writing paragraphs that would be inserted into President Monroe's annual message to Congress, a speech usually reserved for dull reports on the budget, Indian affairs, and the maintenance of lighthouses. Adams was planning to hide a geopolitical bomb inside a bureaucratic report. He dipped his quill. He needed to distill the complex web of fears, Russian expansion, French invasion, British manipulation into clear, hard principles. Principle 1. Non-colonization. This was the shot aimed at the Tsar. The American continents, Adams wrote, his hand cramping, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. It was a closed sign hung on the entire hemisphere. No more Russian forts in California, no more French trading posts in Texas. The era of European discovery was over. Principle 2. Non-intervention. This was the shot aimed at the Holy Alliance. In the wars of the European powers in matters relating to themselves, we have never taken any part, nor does it comport with our policy to do so. It is only when our rights are invaded or seriously menaced that we resent injuries or make preparation for our defense. He was drawing a line in the Atlantic Ocean. He was defining the two spheres theory. You stay in your old world of monarchs and intrigue. We will stay in our new world of republics and commerce. He took the drafts to the White House. Monroe reviewed them. The president, emboldened by his decision to stand alone, added his own touches. He softened the tone slightly, stripping away some of Adams' prickliest insults to the British, but he kept the core of steel. They were building a wall of words. The Capitol Building, December 2nd, 1823. The morning of December 2nd was cold and clear. In 1823, the president did not go to the Capitol to deliver the State of the Union address in person. That monarchical tradition had been abandoned by Thomas Jefferson. Instead, the president sent a written manuscript to Congress, where it was read aloud by a clerk. Inside the House of Representatives, the mood was routine. The congressmen sat in their semicircle, spitting tobacco into brass spittoons, gossiping about the upcoming election of 1824. They expected a boring recitation of the budget surplus and perhaps a report on the suppression of the slave trade. The reading clerk of the House stood up. He unrolled the heavy parchment. He began to read. The first 10 minutes were exactly what they expected. Dry, administrative details. Some congressmen dozed, others wrote letters, but then the clerk reached the paragraphs regarding foreign relations. The occasion has been judged proper for asserting, as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved. The clerk's voice droned on, but the words began to land like hammer blows. We should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. Heads snapped up. The scratching of pens stopped. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintained it, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States. A silence descended on the chamber. It was a breathtaking declaration. The United States, a nation that had just lost its capital city to an invading army 9 years earlier, was effectively threatening war against the combined powers of Europe if they touched Latin America. It was bold, it was defiant, and to anyone who knew the actual state of the American military, it was almost laughable. The empty cannons. As the clerk finished reading and the message was filed, the reality of the bluff began to sink in for the few men who knew the truth. John Quincy Adams sat in the gallery watching. He knew exactly what lay behind those words. The Army, less than 6,000 men, scattered across a frontier of 2 million square miles. The Navy, a handful of frigates, like the Constitution, rotting at the docks due to budget cuts. The U.S. Navy couldn't even suppress the pirates in the Caribbean, let alone stop a French fleet of 50 ships of the line. The economy, still recurring from the Panic of 1819, the U.S. Treasury could barely afford to pave the streets of Washington, let alone fund a transatlantic war. If the Holy Alliance decided to call the bluff, if the French king ordered his fleet to sail for New Orleans, or if the Tsar ordered his Cossacks south from Alaska, the United States could do absolutely nothing to stop them. The Monroe Doctrine, though it wouldn't be called that for another 30 years, was a paper shield. It was a warning shot fired from a cannon that had no gunpowder. The echo, but Adams knew something the congressman didn't. He knew the British Foreign Minister, George Canning, had already checkmated the French with the Polignac Memorandum. He knew the British Navy, not the American one, would enforce this doctrine simply to protect their own trade. Adams had hijacked the British Navy without paying for a single ship. As the congressman filed out of the Capitol, buzzing with the audacity of the message, the courier ships were already preparing to carry the text to Europe. The bluff was cast. The words were on the table. Now Washington held its breath, waiting to hear if the kings of Europe would tremble, or if they would just laugh. Vienna, Austrian Empire, January 1824. The text of President Monroe's message did not arrive in Europe via a thunderbolt. It arrived in a diplomatic pouch, carried by a seasick courier, traveling at the speed of a sailing ship fighting winter gales. It took 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic and another 2 weeks to cross the snowy roads of the continent. When it finally landed on the desk of Prince Clemens von Metternich in the Chancellery of Vienna, the paper was damp and wrinkled. Metternich, the architect of the Holy Alliance and the most powerful man in Europe, picked it up with the tips of his fingers, as if it were a soiled rag. He adjusted his monocle and began to read the French translation. He read the claim that the American continents were closed to colonization. He read the threat that any European intervention would be viewed as an unfriendly act. He stopped reading. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. "It is an act of indecent arrogance," Metternich murmured to his aide. To Metternich, the United States was not a nation. It was a failed experiment run by shopkeepers and farmers. It was a country that had burned its own capital to the ground less than a decade prior. It had no standing army. Its navy was a joke. Its treasury was empty. And yet this mud-hole republic was ordering the emperors of Russia, Austria, and France to stay in their rooms. "Mr. Monroe," Metternich wrote in his private journal that night, "has launched a manifesto that would be a declaration of war if it were not so pitifully laughable. These men in Washington possess the rhetoric of giants and the strength of mice." In the coffee houses of Vienna, the message became the punchline of the season. The aristocrats, wrapped in furs, joked about the general of the swamps, forbidding the Tsar of all the Russias from taking a walk in California. They didn't fear the doctrine. They dismissed it as the barking of a small dog behind a very high fence. Paris, Kingdom of France, February 1824. In Paris, the reaction was less amused and more annoyed. The French foreign minister, the Vicomte de Chateaubriand, was a romantic and a royalist. He had been the one dreaming of sending a French armada to reconquer Mexico for Spain, and perhaps snag a few trading ports for France. When he read Monroe's message, he didn't laugh. He sneered. "This is not American policy," Chateaubriand told the king, Louis XIII. "This is British ventriloquism." The French were not fooled. They looked at the map. They knew the United States couldn't stop a French rowboat, let alone a fleet. They knew that if the French Navy sailed for New Orleans, the city would fall in a week. But they also knew who was standing behind the Americans. "It is Canning," Chateaubriand spat. "The British have put words in the mouths of the Americans. Monroe is the puppet. The Royal Navy is the puppeteer." The French press had a field day. Le Constitutionnel mocked the audacity of the Americans, calling the doctrine a piece of paper sword-rattling. "Let Mr. Monroe come to Cadiz," one editorial challenged, "and see the difference between a real army and a militia of tobacco farmers." But beneath the sneers there was a bitter realization. The French couldn't call the bluff, not because they feared the U.S. Army, but because they feared the British blockade. The bluff was working, not because of American strength, but because of European rivalry. St. Petersburg, Russian Empire, March 1824. The message took the longest to reach the Winter Palace. Tsar Alexander I was no longer the young mystic who had drafted the Holy Alliance. He was older, paranoid, and increasingly reactionary. He considered himself the father of all monarchs and the scourge of all republicans. When the American minister, Henry Middleton, nervously presented the text of the message to the Russian Foreign Ministry, the reaction was icy silence. The Tsar felt personally insulted. The non-colonization clause was aimed directly at his ukase claiming the Oregon coast. "The President of the United States," the Russian Foreign Minister, Count Nesselrode, wrote in a blistering reply, "enunciates views that are entirely seemingly to his republican principles, but which the imperial government finds devoid of any basis in international law." Translation: "You don't make the rules, we do." The Russians pointed out with scathing accuracy that the United States didn't actually own the land they were protecting. They were claiming guardianship over a continent, South America, that didn't ask for their help, and forbidding expansion into territories, the Northwest, that were legally unclaimed. "It is the logic of a land grabber," Nesselrode sneered. The Tsar briefly considered issuing a counter-decree, forbidding American ships from the Baltic, but he was distracted. The Ottoman Empire was crumbling. The Greeks were revolting. He had bigger fish to fry than the noisy Republicans across the ocean. He decided to treat the Monroe Doctrine with the ultimate weapon of the autocrat: indifference. He would simply ignore it. The silence of the cannons. And so the great powers of Europe had their laugh. They mocked the grammar. They mocked the military weakness. And they mocked the sheer hubris of James Monroe and John Quincy Adams. But then, a strange thing happened. Nothing. The French fleet in Cadiz did not sail for Mexico. The Russian forts in California were not reinforced. The Holy Alliance did not launch a crusade to restore the Spanish colonies. The sneer faded into a shrug. The European courts decided that the game wasn't worth the candle. South America was a chaotic mess of jungles, mountains, and yellow fever. Retaking it would cost millions of francs and rubles. And if the British Navy was going to harass their supply lines, why bother? They didn't stop because they were afraid of the Monroe Doctrine. They stopped because the prize wasn't worth the fight with the British Lion. But in Washington, D.C., the nuances were lost. The American public didn't hear the laughter in Vienna. They only saw that the Europeans didn't come. They looked at the empty horizon, where the French invasion fleet was supposed to be, and they cheered. "We did it!" the newspapers crowed. "The president spoke, and the kings trembled." It was the birth of a national myth. The United States began to believe its own press. They believed that words alone had stopped the armies of Europe. They didn't see the invisible shield that had actually protected them. They didn't see the Union Jack flying just over the horizon. The North Atlantic, 1824. The Atlantic Ocean is a vast, gray wilderness. But in the 19th century, it had landlords, while the politicians in Washington toasted their own audacity, and the aristocrats in Vienna chuckled at American arrogance. The reality of the Monroe Doctrine was being played out on the heaving decks of British warships. The HMS Ganges, an 84-gun ship of the line, plowed through the swells off the coast of Brazil. She was a floating fortress of oak and canvas, manned by 600 hardened sailors who ate salted pork and drank grog. Her cannons could level a coastal town in an hour. She was not flying the Stars and Stripes. She was flying the Union Jack. The captain of the Ganges did not care about James Monroe. He had likely never read the president's message. He was not patrolling these waters to defend the abstract principles of republicanism or to protect the sister republics of Latin America. He was there for a much simpler reason: markets, the merchants' war. In London, George Canning sat in the Foreign Office, reading the trade reports with a satisfied smile. The collapse of the Spanish Empire had cracked open a piñata of wealth. For 3 centuries, Madrid had maintained a rigid monopoly. Latin American colonies could only trade with Spain. Now, with the Spanish gone, the ports of Buenos Aires, Valparaiso, and Veracruz were wide open. British factories in Manchester were churning out cotton textiles for Chilean cowboys. British foundries in Birmingham were casting steam engines for Mexican silver mines. British banks in the City of London were underwriting the loans for the new governments in Colombia and Peru. By 1824, British exports to Latin America had tripled. It was an economic boom that was pulling Britain out of its post-Napoleonic recession. Canning knew that if France or Russia recolonized these lands, the first thing they would do is slam the door shut. They would reinstate the monopolies. They would seize British assets. So the order went out to the Admiralty. The Atlantic is closed. The wooden wall. The enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine was quiet, brutal, and invisible to the American public. It didn't happen in great battles. It happened in subtle signals. When a French squadron gathered in the Mediterranean, a larger British squadron would coincidentally appear on the horizon, shadowing them. The message was clear: if you sail west, you will have to sail through us. When the Spanish King Ferdinand VII tried to assemble a ragtag fleet in Cadiz to retake Mexico, British agents leaked information that the Royal Navy would consider any armed expedition a threat to British commerce. The Spanish fleet rotted at the docks. To the merchant ships of the United States, the whalers from Nantucket and the traders from Boston, the Royal Navy was a strange paradox. For 50 years, these British ships had been the enemy. They had impressed American sailors. They had blockaded American ports. Now, suddenly, they were the bouncers at the club, letting the Americans walk right in. American ships sailed safely to Rio and Havana, protected by the very guns that had bombarded Fort McHenry. They traded, they profited, and they spread the news of the Monroe Doctrine, completely oblivious to the fact that their safety was guaranteed by the British taxpayer. The great irony. In Washington, the illusion was complete. John Quincy Adams, the realist, knew the truth. He knew that the cockboat was being towed by the man of war, just as he had feared. But he also knew that it didn't matter why the British were doing it, only that they were doing it. For the American public, however, the nuance was lost. They saw a Europe that respected them. They didn't see the British puppeteer. This created a strange psychological effect in the American mind. The United States began to view the Atlantic isolation as a natural right, rather than a geopolitical gift from London. They began to take for granted that Europe would stay away. It was the ultimate free ride. For nearly a century, from 1823 until World War I, the United States spent almost nothing on a navy capable of projecting power overseas. They didn't have to. The Royal Navy was the invisible shield. Britain policed the world's oceans, suppressed piracy, and kept the European powers bottled up. The United States grew rich and powerful behind this shield, expanding west across the continent, secure in the knowledge that their back door was guarded by their old enemy. Canning's boast. George Canning, the man who had orchestrated the whole affair, had the last laugh. In 1826, facing criticism in Parliament for allowing the French to occupy Spain, Canning rose to defend his policy. He delivered one of the most famous lines in diplomatic history. He admitted that he had let France take Spain. But, he argued, he had ensured that Spain was just a shell. By protecting the independence of Latin America, with the help of the Monroe Doctrine bluff, he had stripped the Spanish Empire of its wealth. I resolved that if France had Spain, it should not be Spain with the Indies, Hull Canning thundered to the cheering House of Commons. I called the New World into existence to redress the balance of the old. It was a brilliant piece of political theater. Canning claimed credit for the liberty of the Americas. In Washington, Adams read the speech and scowled. He knew Canning was right. The Englishman had used the Americans as a prop in his grand strategy. But Adams also knew that the prop had become a pillar. The bluff had worked. The shield was holding, and, behind that shield, the United States was about to turn its eyes away from the ocean and look toward the one thing the British promised not to touch: Texas. The invisible shield had secured the sea. Now, the American eagle was ready to sharpen its claws on the land. For 20 years, the Monroe Doctrine slept. It was not a law, it was not a treaty, it was just a few paragraphs in a dusty speech. Most Americans had forgotten it. The Europeans had ignored it. John Quincy Adams, the architect, had served his one miserable term as president and returned to Congress, a bitter old man fighting against slavery. The doctrine had served its purpose. It had kept the French and Russians out. But now, in the 1840s, the threat wasn't coming from Europe invading the Americas. The threat was the Americas invading themselves. The United States was bursting at the seams. The population was exploding. Settlers were pouring over the Appalachians, hungry for land. They looked at the vast, empty spaces of the West, Mexican territory, and they didn't see a sovereign neighbor. They saw their future. They called it manifest destiny. And the man who would turn this hunger into policy was a dark horse candidate from Tennessee, who came out of nowhere to seize the White House. Young Hickory James K. Polk was small, humorless, and possessed the work ethic of a machine. He was not a philosopher like Jefferson or a diplomat like Adams. He was a land grabber. When Polk took office in 1845, he had 4 goals. One of them was to acquire California. Another was to settle the Oregon boundary. Both involved confronting European powers. Polk dusted off Monroe's old message. He realized that the doctrine, originally designed as a defensive shield against Europe, could be weaponized into an offensive sword for American expansion. The flashpoint was Texas. The Lone Star Republic had broken away from Mexico in 1836. For 9 years, it had existed as an independent nation, teetering on the brink of bankruptcy and constant war with Mexico. But Texas wasn't just looking at Washington for help. They were flirting with London. British diplomats were buzzing around Austin. They saw an opportunity. If Britain could guarantee Texan independence, they could create a buffer state, a cotton republic, that would block the westward expansion of the United States. It would be a British satellite, trading cotton for British-manufactured goods, free of American tariffs. To Polk, this was a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. We cannot allow, Polk thundered to his advisors, a European power to establish a sphere of influence on our border. It is a form of colonization by other means. The Resurrection, December 2nd, 1845. In his first annual message to Congress, exactly 22 years to the day after Monroe's original message, Polk resurrected the doctrine. But he changed it. Monroe had said, "Europe, stay out of the Americas." Polk essentially said, "Europe, stay out of the way, while we take the Americas." Polk declared that the people of this continent alone had the right to decide their own destiny. If the Texans wanted to join the U.S., that was their business. If the Californians wanted to rebel against Mexico, that was their business. Any European attempt to maintain a balance of power in North America was an unfriendly act. It was a brilliant twist. He used the language of anti-colonialism to justify American imperialism. He annexed Texas. The British fumed. The Mexicans were furious. But Polk didn't stop there. The Oregon crisis. Polk turned his eyes north to Oregon. For decades, the Oregon Territory, modern-day Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, had been jointly occupied by the U.S. and Britain. It was a peaceful arrangement. Polk wanted it all. 54 dig 40s or fight! Became the rallying cry. He used the Monroe Doctrine again. He argued that allowing Britain to keep colonies in Oregon was a violation of the principle of non-colonization. It was a dangerous game. He was poking the British lion, the very power that had been enforcing the doctrine for 20 years. But Polk was lucky. The British were tired. They didn't want a war over fur-trapping land in the Pacific Northwest when they had bigger problems in India and Ireland. They blinked. They agreed to split the territory at the 49th parallel. Polk had won. He had used the doctrine to bully the superpower that was supposed to be its guarantor. The War for the West, 1846 to 1848. With the British neutralized, Polk turned the full force of the United States against Mexico. The Mexican-American War was the doctrine's first blooding. It wasn't a defensive war against a European invader. It was a war of conquest against a neighbor. But Polk framed it as a necessary act to prevent European meddling. Rumors, mostly false, swirled that Mexico was planning to sell California to Britain to pay off its debts. "We must take California," Polk argued, "to save it from the British." The American armies marched south. They captured Mexico City. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the U.S. swallowed half of Mexico's territory. The Monroe Doctrine had mutated. It was no longer just a keep-out sign. It was now a reserved-for-future-use sign. Europe watched in shock. The Monroe Republic was now a continental empire, stretching from sea to shining sea. The bluff had become a reality. The United States was no longer a cockboat. It was building its own man of war. But as the dust settled on the conquered West, a new shadow was rising. The expansion had reopened the wound of slavery, and the very success of Polk's resurrection would lead the nation directly into the fires of civil war. The doctrine had secured the continent, but it was about to tear the country apart. Veracruz, Mexico, December 1861. While the United States was busy tearing itself apart at Bull Run and Shiloh, the vultures finally landed. For 40 years, the Monroe Doctrine had held the Europeans at bay. But the doctrine relied on one crucial assumption: a united, powerful American republic that could threaten, or at least annoy, any intruder. In 1861, that republic was gone. The Union was fractured. The U.S. Navy was blockading its own ports. The U.S. Army was killing its own citizens. The keep out sign had fallen down. Napoleon III, the Emperor of the French and nephew of the great Bonaparte, saw the opening. He dreamed of a Latin empire in the Americas, a Catholic monarchist counterweight to the Protestant Republican United States. He wanted access to Mexican silver and a foothold to check Anglo-Saxon expansion. Using the pretext of unpaid debts, Mexico was, as usual, bankrupt. Napoleon III sent a massive fleet to Veracruz. At first, the British and Spanish joined him, But when they realized the French intended conquest, not just debt collection, they withdrew. The French marched inland. They were checked at Puebla on Cinco de Mayo, 1862, a glorious but temporary victory for Mexico. But by 1863, French troops had seized Mexico City. Napoleon III didn't just want to occupy Mexico. He wanted to transform it. He needed a puppet. He found one in the dreamy, romantic, and utterly deluded Archduke Maximilian of Austria. The Austrian on the cactus throne. Maximilian was a Habsburg prince, tall, blonde, with a parted beard and a belief in the divine right of kings that was centuries out of date. He was a liberal at heart, a botanist, and a man who genuinely wanted to save Mexico. He was convinced by French agents that the Mexican people were crying out for a monarchy. In 1864, Maximilian and his ambitious wife Carlota sailed to Veracruz. They arrived to a staged reception of cheering crowds, paid for by the French army. They installed themselves in Chapultepec Castle. It was the ultimate violation of the Monroe Doctrine. A European army had invaded a sovereign American republic, overthrown its government, and installed a European prince as emperor. And the United States did nothing. Lincoln's silence. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of State William Seward watched the events in Mexico with horror. The French intervention was a nightmare. A French-controlled Mexico on the southern border could provide a lifeline to the Confederacy. There were rumors that Napoleon III might recognize the South in exchange for their support of Maximilian. But Lincoln was pragmatic. He was fighting for the survival of the Union. He could not fight France at the same time. One war at a time, Lincoln famously told his advisors. So, the Monroe Doctrine was put into a medically induced coma. Seward sent polite, carefully worded notes to Paris. He expressed concern. He refused to recognize Maximilian. But he did not threaten war. He did not cite the doctrine. The bluff had been called. The French were in Mexico, and the U.S. was powerless to stop them. The Resurrection, 1865. Then came Appomattox. In April 1865, the Civil War ended. The Union was preserved. And suddenly, the United States possessed the largest, most battle-hardened army on the planet. Almost overnight, the geopolitical math flipped. General Ulysses S. Grant wanted to march 50,000 blue-coated veterans straight to the Rio Grande and kick the French into the sea. "The Monroe Doctrine," Grant growled, "is not dead. It was just reloading." Secretary Seward, ever the diplomat, restrained Grant. He didn't want a new war. He wanted to win by intimidation. Seward sent a new note to Napoleon III. The tone was no longer polite. It was icy. He demanded to know when French troops would be withdrawn. Simultaneously, the U.S. government accidentally lost 30,000 muskets near the border, which were happily found by the Mexican Republican forces, led by Benito Juarez, who had been fighting a guerrilla war in the mountains. The collapse. Napoleon III looked at the chessboard. In Europe, a new power was rising. Prussia, Bismarck was unifying Germany, and the drums of war were beating on the Rhine. Napoleon needed every soldier he had back home. Across the Atlantic, the United States was unified and angry. A war with the U.S. would be a disaster. Napoleon cut his losses. He ordered the French troops to withdraw from Mexico. He begged Maximilian to come with them. "Abdicate," Napoleon urged. "The game is up." But Maximilian, poor deluded Maximilian, refused. He believed he was the beloved emperor. He believed his Mexican generals would stand by him. He believed a Habsburg did not run. The French troops marched to the coast and sailed away in 1866 and 1867. Maximilian was left alone. The Republican forces of Juarez swept down from the hills. They crushed Maximilian's small army of loyalists. The emperor was captured at Querétaro, the Hill of Bells. On June 19, 1867, on a dusty hill outside Querétaro, the Monroe Doctrine exacted its price in blood. Maximilian stood before a firing squad. He gave a gold coin to each executioner, asking them to aim for his heart so his mother could see his face in the casket. "I forgive everyone," he said in Spanish, "and I ask everyone to forgive me. May my blood, which is about to be shed, be for the good of the country. Viva Mexico! Viva la independencia!" The muskets cracked. The emperor fell. The execution of Maximilian sent a shockwave through the courts of Europe. It was a brutal, bloody statement. The era of European adventure in the Americas was over. The United States had survived its Civil War, and the Monroe Doctrine had risen from the grave, stronger and more lethal than before. It was no longer a bluff. It was a law written in iron and enforced by a nation that had learned how to kill on an industrial scale. The Jungle Border, 1895. For decades, the Monroe Doctrine had been a shield. In 1895, it became a bludgeon. The conflict started in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map: the steaming gold-rich jungle border between Venezuela and British Guyana, modern-day Guyana. For 50 years, Britain and Venezuela had argued over where the line was drawn. When gold was discovered in the disputed territory, the argument turned dangerous. Great Britain, the superpower of the age, simply refused to negotiate. They drew a line, the Schomburg Line, and said, "This is ours." Venezuela, weak and desperate, appealed to Washington. They invoked the sacred name of Monroe. "Protect us," they begged, "from European encroachment." In the White House, President Grover Cleveland was looking for a fight. The U.S. economy was in a depression. He needed a distraction. He needed to show that the United States was no longer a junior partner to Britain. He turned to his Secretary of State, Richard Olney. The 20-inch gun. Richard Olney was a corporate lawyer from Boston with a bulldog temperament and a complete lack of diplomatic finesse. He didn't believe in polite notes. He believed in ultimatums. He sat down and drafted a diplomatic note to the British government that would go down in history as the 20-inch gun, referring to the massive coastal artillery of the era. It wasn't a request. It was a roar. Olney demanded that Britain submit the border dispute to arbitration. But he went further. He didn't just cite the Monroe Doctrine. He expanded it into a declaration of hemispheric supremacy. "Today, the United States is practically sovereign on this continent," Olney wrote, his pen scratching violently across the page. "And its fiat is law, upon the subjects to which it confines its interposition." Read that again. Its fiat is law. Olney was claiming that the United States had the right to dictate terms anywhere in North or South America simply because it was big, powerful, and there. It was breathtaking arrogance. He was telling the British Empire, the empire on which the sun never set, to back down or face the consequences. He sent the note to London. The lion roars back, briefly. In London, the British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, read the note with incredulity. He was an aristocrat of the old school. He viewed the United States as a boisterous, ill-mannered teenager. Salisbury waited 4 months to reply. When he did, he treated Olney like a schoolboy who had failed a history exam. He lectured Olney. He pointed out that the Monroe Doctrine was not international law. He pointed out that the border dispute had nothing to do with colonization. He essentially told the U.S. to mind its own business. The government of the United States is not entitled to affirm, as a universal proposition, with reference to a number of independent states for whose conduct it assumes no responsibility, that its interests are necessarily concerned in whatever may befall those states, Salisbury wrote. Translation: "You are not the boss of the Americas." The war scare. When Salisbury's reply hit Washington in December 1895, President Cleveland didn't blink. He went to Congress. He asked for funding to create a commission to determine the true border. And then he dropped the bomb. Once the US determined where the line was, it would enforce it. By every means in its power, Cleveland threatened. That meant war. The stock market crashed. Panic swept Wall Street. The newspapers went wild. "War with England!" screamed the headlines. For a few weeks, it looked like the two great English-speaking nations were going to destroy each other over a strip of mosquito-infested jungle. But then, reality set in. In London, the British government looked at the map. They were facing rising tensions with Germany. The Kaiser was building a navy. They were fighting wars in Africa. The Boer War was looming. Did they really want to fight the United States, a nation with massive industrial potential, over a gold mine in Guyana? The British realized something profound. The United States had grown up. It was no longer the cockboat of 1823. It was a titan. Its steel production rivaled Britain's. Its population was booming. Britain made a cold, calculated decision. They needed America as a friend, more than they needed the Schomburg Line. The Great Rapprochement. Lord Salisbury folded. He agreed to arbitration. He accepted the U.S. intervention. He tacitly acknowledged that the Monroe Doctrine, while not law, was a reality that Britain had to respect. It was a turning point in world history. The British Empire, the master of the world for a century, had officially handed the keys of the Western Hemisphere to the United States. The arbitration tribunal eventually met. In Paris, ironically. They awarded most of the territory to Britain anyway. But the gold mine didn't matter. The principle mattered. The Olney shout had echoed across the ocean, and for the first time, Europe had listened not out of convenience, but out of fear. The United States was no longer just protecting the Americas, it was owning them. The doctrine had mutated again. It had gone from Europe, keep out, to we are in charge. And just a few years later, a Rough Rider named Theodore Roosevelt would take that logic to its ultimate imperial conclusion. The White House, December 1904. If James Monroe was the quiet architect who put up the no trespassing sign, Theodore Roosevelt was the bouncer who decided to start patting down the guests. TR was a force of nature, a bespectacled, teeth-gnashing whirlwind of energy who had charged up San Juan Hill and wrestled the presidency into the 20th century. He did not view the world through the legalistic lens of John Quincy Adams. He viewed it through the Darwinian lens of power. By 1904, the United States was no longer a bluffing upstart. It had thrashed Spain in 1898. It possessed Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and a rising navy. But Roosevelt had a problem. He looked south at the sister republics of Latin America, and he didn't see noble experiments in democracy. He saw chaos, bankruptcy, and revolution. And in that chaos, he saw a loophole in the Monroe Doctrine that terrified him. The Venezuelan crisis, the sequel, 1902. 2 years earlier, the dictator of Venezuela, Cipriano Castro, had defaulted on millions of dollars in loans to European banks. He basically told Germany, Britain, and Italy to go to hell. The Europeans didn't take it well. The German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, sent gunboats. They blockaded the Venezuelan coast. They sank Venezuelan ships. They bombarded forts. Roosevelt watched nervously from Washington. He knew the Europeans had a right to collect their debts. International law said so. But he also knew that debt collection was often a Trojan horse for colonization. If the Germans landed troops to seize the customs houses, they might never leave. They might turn a naval base into a colony. This created a paradox for the Monroe Doctrine. If the U.S. stopped Europe from collecting debts, the U.S. was protecting deadbeats and thieves. If the U.S. let Europe collect debts, the U.S. risked European military expansion in the Caribbean. Roosevelt, pacing the floor of the executive office, realized there was only one solution. It was ugly, it was imperialistic, and it was brilliant. The corollary. On December 6, 1904, Roosevelt delivered his annual message to Congress. Buried in the text was a paragraph that fundamentally rewrote American foreign policy. It came to be known as the Roosevelt Corollary. Chronic wrongdoing, Roosevelt wrote, or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society, may in America as elsewhere ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation. He continued, dropping the hammer. In the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. The transformation was complete. Monroe, 1823. Europe, you cannot come here to conquer. Roosevelt, 1904. Europe, you don't need to come here. If a Latin American country misbehaves, we will conquer them for you, collect your money, and mail you the check. The United States had appointed itself the sheriff of the hemisphere. It was no longer just protecting Latin America from Europe. It was protecting Europe from Latin America, the customs house. Takeover TR didn't just talk, he acted. In the Dominican Republic, the government was bankrupt and European creditors were circling. Roosevelt didn't wait for the German gunboats. He sent the U.S. Navy. American officials seized the Dominican customs houses, the main source of government revenue. They collected the taxes. They kept 45% to run the Dominican government and sent 55% to the European bankers to pay off the debts. It worked. The debt was paid. The Europeans stayed home. Stability was restored. But the cost was sovereignty. The Dominican Republic was no longer an independent nation. It was a financial protectorate of the United States. This set the template for the next 30 years. The big stick policy meant Marines landing in Haiti, Nicaragua, and Cuba whenever a president threatened American business interests or failed to pay his bills. To the Latin Americans, the Monroe Doctrine had mutated into a monster. It wasn't a shield against imperialism anymore. It was imperialism. They called it Yankee imperialism. The Great White Fleet. To punctuate this new era, Roosevelt decided he needed a symbol that even the densest European monarch couldn't miss. He ordered the entire U.S. Atlantic battleship fleet, 16 gleaming ships of the line, hulls painted stark white, to sail around the world. In December 1907, the Great White Fleet steamed out of Hampton Roads, Virginia. It was a pageant of raw industrial power. As the fleet sailed past Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, the message was unmistakable. Look at our guns, look at our reach. The Caribbean is an American lake. The Pacific is an American pond. When the fleet arrived in Japan, a rising power that had just defeated Russia, thousands of schoolchildren waved American flags. But the Japanese admirals counted the guns. The Monroe Doctrine was no longer a bluff. It was backed by steel battleships that could circumnavigate the globe. Roosevelt left office in 1909, leaving behind a changed world. He had turned the United States into a global power, but he had also sown the seeds of deep resentment in Latin America, seeds that would grow into a jungle of anti-Americanism that would entangle U.S. policy for the rest of the century. The policeman was on the beat, but the neighborhood was starting to hate him. The Caribbean Sea, October 1962. For 139 years, the Monroe Doctrine had faced threats. It had faced the French army in Mexico, the British fleet in Venezuela, and the German gunboats in the Caribbean. But it had never faced the apocalypse. In October 1962, the doctrine ceased to be a diplomatic theory. It became the trigger mechanism for World War III. The premise was simple. The doctrine stated that no foreign power could extend its system to the Western Hemisphere. For nearly a century and a half, that meant monarchies. But now, the foreign system was communism. And the power wasn't a fading European empire. It was the Soviet Union, armed with nuclear weapons capable of incinerating Washington, D.C. in 15 minutes. The photograph. On the morning of October 16th, President John F. Kennedy sat in the Oval Office. He was young, charismatic, and dangerously untested. He stared at a series of grainy black and white photographs taken by a U-2 spy plane over San Cristobal, Cuba. To the untrained eye, they looked like smudges in the jungle. But the CIA analysts pointed out the terrifying details. Missile erectors, fuel trucks, oxidizer tanks, medium-range ballistic missiles, MMRBMs. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, had gambled. He had secretly shipped nuclear weapons to Fidel Castro's Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. It was the ultimate violation of the Monroe Doctrine. It wasn't just colonization. It was the placement of a loaded gun against America's temple. Kennedy's advisors, the Executive Committee, ExComm, were in a panic. The generals wanted to bomb Cuba immediately. They wanted to invade. They wanted to unleash the full force of the U.S. military to uphold the doctrine. If we do nothing, Attorney General Robert Kennedy argued, the Monroe Doctrine is dead, and so is our credibility. But JFK hesitated. He knew what the generals didn't want to admit. An invasion of Cuba would trigger a Soviet invasion of Berlin, which would trigger a nuclear exchange, which would end civilization. The quarantine. Kennedy needed a solution that upheld the doctrine without starting Armageddon. He couldn't call it a blockade. A blockade was an act of war under international law. So, borrowing a page from the history books, he called it a quarantine. On October 26, JFK went on television. He looked into the camera, his face grave. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. It was the Monroe Doctrine, aimed at the atomic age. He wasn't just protecting the hemisphere from colonization. He was drawing a nuclear line in the ocean, the stare down. For 6 days, the world held its breath. Soviet ships carrying more missiles steamed toward the quarantine line. U.S. Navy destroyers, guns trained, waited to intercept them. Strategic Air Command bombers circled the Arctic, loaded with hydrogen bombs. In the White House, the tension was physical. We were eyeball to eyeball, Secretary of State Dean Rusk later said. The doctrine was being tested in the most literal way possible. Could the United States effectively forbid a European power from entering the hemisphere? On October 24th, the Soviet ships slowed down. Then they stopped. Then they turned around. I think the other guy just blinked, Rusk whispered. The secret deal. The crisis didn't end with a bang, but with a quiet backroom deal. Much like the original doctrine itself, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. In exchange, Kennedy publicly promised never to invade Cuba, respecting Castro's sovereignty in a way the doctrine usually ignored, and secretly agreed to remove obsolete U.S. missiles from Turkey. The world stepped back from the brink. But the legacy for the Monroe Doctrine was complicated. Kennedy had saved the world, but he had accepted a communist state in the Caribbean. The "Keep Out" sign now had an asterisk. You can't have missiles, but you can have Marxism. The doctrine had prevented nuclear war, but it had failed to prevent the ideological infection John Quincy Adams had feared. The hemisphere was no longer a unified fortress of republicanism. It was a battlefield of the Cold War. The Organization of American States, Washington, D.C., November 18, 2013. The end of the story, or at least the official obituary, arrived not with a bang, but with a press release. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry stood before a room full of Latin American diplomats. These were the representatives of the nations Bolivar had liberated. the nations Monroe had promised to protect, and the nations Roosevelt had policed. Kerry smiled and delivered a line that was meant to bury 190 years of history. "The era of the Monroe Doctrine is over," Kerry declared. "The relationship that we seek and that we have worked hard to foster is not about a United States declaration about how and when it will intervene in the affairs of other American states. It's about all of our countries viewing one another as equals." The diplomats applauded politely. But in the capitals of Havana, Caracas, and Buenos Aires, the ghosts of the past were surely raising a skeptical eyebrow. Can a superpower ever truly retire its sphere of influence? The Great Transformation. As we look back at the 30,000 words of history we have traversed, the Monroe Doctrine stands as the ultimate American paradox. It began in 1823 as a bluff. A weak, terrified nation led by an old man, Monroe, and a brilliant cynic, Adams, stood on the shoreline and shouted at the waves. They had no army, no money, and no navy. They relied on the invisible shield of their British enemy to protect them. But power is not static. As the United States grew, the doctrine mutated. Under Polk, 1840s, the shield became a sword. The doctrine was used to justify seizing Texas and California, turning the anti-colonial policy into an engine of American expansion. Under Roosevelt, 1904, the sword became a badge. The doctrine became a license to police the neighborhood, turning sovereign nations into protectorates to keep the peace. Under JFK and Reagan, Cold War, the badge became a nuclear trigger. The doctrine was the red line that brought the world to the edge of annihilation to keep an alien ideology, communism, out of the hemisphere. John Quincy Adams had famously warned that America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. But by weaponizing his doctrine, his successors found monsters everywhere. In the jungles of Nicaragua, the mountains of Chile, and the customs houses of the Dominican Republic. The irony of success. The ultimate irony is that the United States became exactly what it was trying to prevent. In 1823, Adams feared a holy alliance that would intervene in sovereign states, impose its will, and crush dissent. By the 20th century, to much of Latin America, the United States was the Holy Alliance. We became the European power. We were the ones landing Marines. We were the ones dictating economic terms. We were the ones overthrowing governments like Arbenz in Guatemala or Allende in Chile that didn't align with our system. Bolivar's dream of a Gran Colombia rivalry never materialized, because the vacuum he feared was filled not by France or Russia, but by the sister republic to the north. The zombie doctrine. Is it truly dead? John Kerry said yes. But geopolitics ignores speeches. Today, a new holy alliance is crossing the ocean. It doesn't bring Cossacks or frigates. It brings infrastructure loans and 5G networks. China. Chinese investment in Latin America has exploded. They are building ports in Peru, dams in Ecuador, and railways in Panama. To the modern strategist in Washington, this looks suspiciously like the British trade invasion of the 1820s. When warnings are issued today about foreign adversaries gaining a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, the ghost of James Monroe nods in the corner. The language has changed. We talk about strategic competition now, not colonization. But the fear is the same. The final verdict. The Great American Bluff was the most successful foreign policy maneuver in history. It bought the United States a century of safety. It allowed a fragile republic to grow into a colossus, shielded from the wars of Europe. It secured the resources of 2 continents for the American industrial machine. But the price was trust. The doctrine built a wall around the Western Hemisphere, but it also built a wall between the United States and its neighbors. It created a relationship defined by power, not partnership. As we stand in the 21st century, the United States is no longer a cockboat in the wake of a British man of war. It is the aircraft carrier, but as any captain knows, the bigger the ship, the harder it is to turn. The Monroe Doctrine may be officially retired, written off as a relic of a bygone age. But as long as the United States believes that its security depends on the absence of rivals in its own backyard, the spirit of 1823 will never truly die. It is the DNA of a superpower.